Hello, everyone, and welcome to Oxford Interfaith Forum. It is our great honor to welcome you, and especially our guest speaker, Professor Abdulla Galadari, who is Professor of Islamic Studies in Khalifa University, Abu Dhabi, and he is also the author of wonderful book called Quranic Hermeneutics Between Science, History, and the Bible, among other multiple publications. So we are greatly honored to welcome him, enlighten us about his current research, how Quran agrees with Gospel of John. We are very fortunate to have Cambridge as co-hosts and co-organizers of this event. We have Professor Daniel Weiss, who will be responding, but I will let my colleague, Dr. Iona Hine, to introduce the Cambridge side. Thank you very much, and Iona, over to you.
Thank you, Thea. So I'm Dr. Iona Hine. I'm the Programme Manager of the Cambridge Interfaith Programme based in the Faculty of Divinity at the University of Cambridge. And it's my pleasure this evening to welcome our respondent, who is very well known to me as a colleague at the University of Cambridge. Professor Daniel Weiss joined the Faculty of Divinity way back in 2010 as the first person to hold the role of Polonsky-Coexist Lecturer in Jewish Studies at the Faculty of Divinity, which gives him the gamut of teaching right from the year 200 in the Common Era through to the present day. He is now Professor of Jewish Studies and has specialisms, such broad specialisms that I hesitate to call them specialisms, but in philosophy, in ethics. He's got a particular project at the moment in collaboration with a professor in linguistics, and he works also on early rabbinic literature, recently a collaborative article on AI and idolatry. So that just is to give you an impression of the different things that he can bring to this conversation. And I should say he's also the Deputy Director of the Cambridge Interfaith Programme. So I think we hand first then to our speaker, Professor Galadari.
Well, thank you very much, Thea and Iona, for this lovely platform that you both have for very important topics on interfaith and studies. So I'd like to thank everybody who is here, and I'd like to welcome them being here, especially here in the beginning of 2026. And I'll be talking about the unbegotten, begotten Christ, how the Quran agrees with the Gospel of John. Let me momentarily here share my screen with everyone. A stumbling block in any kind of interfaith dialogue between Christians and Muslims is that whether Christ is begotten or not begotten of God. I'll be looking into this very specific issue closely into how the Quranic text looks at it, how the Gospel of John looks at it, and then linguistically try to unravel, are there more similarities than differences between both texts on how they actually try to understand the person of Christ. According to the New Testament, Jesus is begotten of God, and the Gospel of John emphasizes very much the divine origin of the Logos, or the Word, which the author of John basically identifies as Christ himself. Now, according to the Quran seems to be also very clear, like in this case, that God neither begets nor is begotten. For centuries, one could say that Muslims and Christians have always been debating whether Christ is truly therefore begotten of God or not begotten of God. Well, let's look into the Gospel of John first. In the prologue of the Gospel of John, we have the idea that in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then later on in the beginning of the Gospel of John, the Gospel of John basically says that the Word became flesh and lived amongst us. And we have seen his glory, the glory as of a father's And then in here, of course, monogenos in Greek could either be, it's typically been translated as only begotten, although it's perhaps more precisely unique, meaning unique. So regardless of how one is to understand it, the Gospel of John still recognizes and understands that Christ is begotten of God. So we do see as well in chapter 3 of the Gospel of John, basically there is, to give you the context of chapter 3 of the Gospel of John, a person by the name of Nicodemus comes to Jesus at night, and Jesus tells him that nobody can actually the kingdom of God except those who are born from above. And then Nicodemus says, how can one return back to his mother's womb and be born again? And then Christ basically, or Jesus basically, according to the Gospel of John, tries to explain to Nicodemus two different types of births, that which is physical and that which is spiritual. And then at the end of that dialogue, the author of the Gospel of John later says, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, or only unique son, so that everyone who believes in him may not perish. Now, when we look back into the Quran, specifically on how the Quran portrays Jesus, it says, that is Jesus, son of Mary, the saying of truth about which they doubt. It is not for God to have begotten. And it uses here the Arabic word walad, which literally means a begotten. And then later on, it immediately qualifies it. So the passage immediately qualifies it. It says, if God commands it, he says to it, kun fa-yakūn, be, and it becomes. So the Quran is very adamant. God has not begotten Jesus. However, it immediately qualifies it that whatever God commands, God simply says be, and it becomes. So the question is, does the Quran contradict the Gospel of John? Well, most people for the whole centuries that we've been through simply says, yes, of course it does. Well, I actually say no. And let's see the reason why. Well, how do we say to generate in the Arabic language? There are two ways to say to generate. One using the word walad, which means to beget. But another way to say also to generate is using the verb to be in Arabic, which is kun. So in Arabic, we've got two different ways of generation. One is tawlid, from the root walada, to beget, and the other is takwin, from the root kawana, which is the verb to be, or kun. Now, what is interesting is that when the Quran adamantly says that Jesus is not begotten, it immediately qualifies it with whatever God commands, God says be, and it becomes kun fa-yakūn. So the Quran does not really deny that Jesus is generated of God or from God. It simply denies that Jesus is generated through tawlid, but simultaneously, the Quran emphasizes that Jesus is indeed generated through the concept of takwin, from the verb to be. Now, in the Arabic language, what is really the difference between the two concepts of generation, tawlid and takwin? And even myself, and who actually has Arabic as his first mother tongue, I have no idea. What is the difference between tawlid and takwin? When we say, for example, in modern day standard Arabic, when we want to say generating electricity, we actually use the word tawlid to say it, generating electricity. When we're talking about, for example, cooking food, the ingredients, we call it mukawwinat, which comes from the root kawana, from the verb to be, rather than from the verb walada. And so when we're actually cooking from the ingredients, we're bringing these ingredients or mukawwinat because we're doing some sort of takween with them. We're generating some food out of the different ingredients. So what really is the difference between tawlid and takween? Most Arabic speakers will have no idea, but apparently the Quran is very adamant to prefer one type of generation over the other, especially when it is speaking of Jesus. So the question is this: why does the Quran truly prefer takween over tawlid when describing Jesus' generation? Well, let's look back to the Johannine prologue and try to understand what John is trying to say. So it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him, not one thing came into being. So we understand from John here that in the beginning was this Word, and this Word was with God. This Word was God, and that this Word, or through this Word, everything came into being. Now, when we look into many scholars of the Gospel of John, a lot of them would say, what is the logos? And they have many different, ideas of what John really understands as the logos. Well, in one way, is it rooted in Judaism, in Semitic Judaism? Is it the memra in Aramaic, which means the word, typically to denote the divine name? Or is it rooted in Hellenistic Judaism? Because in Hellenism, the logos is divine wisdom, or Sophia. And this is how Philo of Alexandria, for example, used the concept of the logos. So many scholars have always argued, what does really John truly mean by the logos, and why does he even use the logos in the first place? Now, although there's much debate about what the Johannine logos really is, pretty much there is no debate concerning that the prologue of John truly parallels the prologue of Genesis. So there is very much consensus that the beginning of John pretty much parallels the beginning of Genesis. So according to the Gospel of John, in the beginning was the Word caused every being to become, and the Word itself is God. When we look at Genesis, in the beginning, God speaks. And so obviously speech itself means that a word is being said. And the word that God speaks, according to Genesis, is Yehi in Hebrew. The Septuagint translates it as Genethito, which means let there be. So we do see that there is some parallel between the prologue of John and Genesis. Now, the question is John deviating from Jewish thought in identifying the Word with God? Because if someone says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and this Word caused everything to become, well, very much Jewish. But is John really deviating from Jewish thought when John says, and the Word itself was God? Well, let's look at it from the Hebrew Bible's perspective. Well, how does God self-identify to Moses on Sinai from the burning bush? Well, when Moses, tells, the speaker coming out of this burning bush, who is it that I should tell the people as the one who sent me? And the answer was, Ehia Esher Ehia. I will be that I will be. And it is very important here to recognize that although, like, for example, in many translations, it's I am that I am or something like that, it's more like I will be that I will be, because it's not the pronoun ani, it's actually the verb to be. It's ehya, coming from the root haya, which is from the verb to be. So according to the Jewish perspective, if you would say, if we go back to how the Gospel of John is thinking about it. So is the Gospel of John really looking beyond the Hebrew Bible when it is speaking of the Logos? So if we think of the Logos as the verb to be, as haya, then the Word was in the beginning with God, according to Genesis. The Word caused every being to become, according to Genesis. And according to Exodus, the Word itself is related to God's self-identification. So perhaps John isn't really looking anywhere, in Hellenistic Judaism or anything like that. Perhaps John is simply looking into the Hebrew Bible. Now, how does the understanding of the Johannine Logos make us understand the Qur'an's emphasis on generation through takwwan over generation through tawallad? Well, let us dive a little bit into the Greek. What is begotten in Greek? The word begotten in Greek, or to give birth, is from the word genao. Now, interestingly is that genao is the causal counterpart of the Greek verb to be, ginomai. So, even though it's not the causative form, there is no causative form for ginomai. Although there are causative forms of many different Greek verbs, there is no causative form for ginomai. And the reason is because genao already takes the place of what would have been the causative form of ginomai in Greek. So genao really functions as cause to become, which in other words means to generate. Ginomai, to become, it's to generate, and genao also means to generate. Actually, even the word generate in English comes from the same root of both ginomai and genao, from gene, which is going back to the Proto-Indo-European root, gene, to generate and to give birth, or to have progeny and so forth. When we think about it, therefore, that in the Greek language, genao is therefore simply the causal counterpart of ginomai, which is to be. So the question now is this: why would the Quran emphasize takwwan over tawallad? Well, in Arabic, walada is not related to the verb to be at all. It has nothing to do with it. Walada simply means to beget, literally, physically. It has nothing to do with the word or the root kun, which is the verb to be. So perhaps whenever the Quran rejects Jesus as tawallad of God, but yet emphasizes that Jesus is takawwan of God, it's perhaps because the verb to be, or kun, is how the Quran interprets the Johannine Logos. So it doesn't matter, however one would think, what did John really think of the Logos? So was John really thinking, as I just showed, thinking from a Hebrew Bible perspective? Was John really thinking the Aramaic understanding of the Memra? Was John really thinking in Hellenistic approach? It doesn't matter. What really matters is perhaps what the Quran thinks, what John is saying. So maybe what the Quran thinks that John is saying is that the word that John is speaking about is the verb to be. It is haya in Hebrew, which is related to how God even self-identifies in the Hebrew Bible. So that is why perhaps the Quran is adamant to say, do not say walad when it comes to Jesus, because Jesus is the word of God, but say kun fa-yakūn. It's takawwan. It's the verb to be, because perhaps that is how the Quran understands the Johannine Logos. Now, the Quran appears to differentiate between those two different concepts of generation, whether through tawlid or takween. How does John do it? Well, when we look into the Gospel of John, the Gospel of John basically says, it differentiates between two different types of generation, but using the exact same Greek word, because there is no other Greek word to differentiate. Okay, so for example, in the beginning of the Gospel of John, it says, who were born not of blood or the will of flesh or the will of man, but of God. And then immediately afterwards, it talks about the word becoming flesh, and then talks about that word becoming the monogenos of God. But we here see that because John is using the exact same Greek word to give birth from the word gennao, it still differentiates between that which is born of blood and the will of flesh from that which is born of God. We do see that as well in chapter 3 of the Gospel of John, which is the narrative which I discussed earlier about Nicodemus speaking with Jesus. And in that narrative, basically, Jesus tries to differentiate between two different types of births. That which is born of flesh and that which is born of the Spirit. And then immediately after, again, the Gospel of John talks about the monogeny in which this word is. So again, we do see that the Gospel of John is speaking of two different types of generation, but using the same Greek word, because there is no other Greek word that could describe two different kinds of generation. Maybe the Quran simply makes the distinction by using two different Arabic terms. So the Gospel of John is very explicit in trying to distinguish between two different types of generation, yet using the same Greek word, gennao. The Quran makes that distinction using two different Arabic words, walad and kun, both of which means to generate. Thus, perhaps the Quran may have no issue with the Greek text of the Gospel of John, only how it is to be translated into Arabic. That is perhaps where the Quran is trying to make the distinction. Don't use walad, but use kun instead, in order to translate the Johannine concept of gennao. So, in conclusion, while the Quran denies that Jesus is generated through tawlid, it simultaneously affirms that Jesus is generated through takween. And so, therefore, the Quran may simply be interpreting what it thinks the Johannine logos is. So the Quran perhaps thinks that the Johannine logos is related to the Hebrew haya, which, according to Genesis, is the word that caused everything to be, and which, according to Exodus, is how God self-identifies to Moses, Ehya Asher Ehya. And therefore, kun would be the most natural word in Arabic that would translate the Hebrew haya. And the word walad in Arabic, which means to beget, carries no such significance. The word walad has nothing to do with God creating the world or generating the world, has nothing to do with God's self-identification to Moses. And therefore, perhaps for that reason, the Quran says, don't use that walad, don't use that type of generation when speaking of Jesus, but use kun as the type of generation when speaking of Jesus, because that's perhaps how the Quran is trying to understand the Johannine logos. And so while the Gospel of John explicitly insists on differentiating between that which is born of flesh and blood and that which is born of God, I'm using the same Greek term, the Quran simply makes that distinction using two different Arabic terms. That's pretty much all. Well, thank you all very much, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So I'm been asked to give a response. I found the argument very interesting, and especially I like the way in which you challenge assumptions that there would necessarily be a contradiction between the Quran's understanding and a text such as the Gospel of John. You know, there could be possible disagreements, but I think a lot of readings have been shaped by assuming that that these two texts must be having different conceptions or contradictory conceptions. And so I appreciate the way you challenge that assumption. And I also think the argument about the various aspects of the idea of the logos, especially in the opening chapter of the Gospel of John, especially let's say in the first 13 verses, you do give an argument to show that I think plausibly that could fit with the Quran's conception, especially since the Quran also calls Jesus the Word of God. And so there's that possible connection there. I think you've also, I think, do a good job of showing that in principle, the idea of begetting be understood as the causing to saying that where God says to be and it was. The idea of begetting could in principle, or at least in abstraction, be understood in that way. And so I think that's thought-provoking to look at. I think the place where I would maybe push back a bit, and maybe this could be brought out more in discussion. I think one interesting question is you talk about the Quran interpreting the Gospel of John. And that seems to assume that the Quran is familiar with the text of the Gospel of John. And it may be, you could look at various other of the ways in which the Quran treats biblical narratives. It often seems to talk about them in a general sense of familiarity with the story or narrative, not necessarily that it's got a copy of the text of Genesis in front of it or Exodus, etc. So I'm not sure whether to talk about the Quran interpreting the Gospel of John, whether there'd be a full basis for that on that textual level. But one could talk about the way in which the Quran could be responding to various Christian ways of talking about Jesus or about God, some of which may be themselves shaped by the Gospel of John. So you could draw that connection. I would think it might be more indirect. So whether the argument would bear the weight of a direct textual assumption, I'm not as sure about. But I think the one thing I did want to push back maybe a bit is the way in which the term begotten, because I think you raised some interesting analysis of the term on its own, but the way then the term appears in the Gospel of John. So even if the Quran wasn't directly reading the Gospel of John, we can ask what would the Quran's conception say to the Gospel of John if you put them together, which I think is functionally the same. So if we ask what would the Quran say to the Gospel of John, or understanding it that way, I think the fact that in the Gospel of John, Jesus is talked about not only as begotten by God, that on its own would be, I think you could make your argument, but that the repeated theme is about the Jesus as the only begotten Son, that the pairing of begotten with Son, both in chapter 3, where it's more explicitly there, and then in chapter 1, the first mention in verse 14 of the only begotten of the Father. So that links it with Father. It doesn't say Son explicitly, but that would seem the only begotten of the Father would be connected to Son or sonship. And then in verse 18, I guess there are textual variants. The version you quoted doesn't have Son, but various other manuscripts talk about the only begotten Son in verse 18, so similar to chapter 3. So I think if you bring in the question of the way begotten functions in John as linked to sonship, and especially if you think of the tradition which appears elsewhere in the New Testament of the begotten Son linking to, say, especially Psalm 2:7, where it has the Psalm says, God says to the recipient of the speech, "You are my son; today I have begotten you," and that seems to be related to notions of the designated as king, a position you could say of lordship, and the fact that the Quran doesn't like those who call Jesus Lord, especially say with the there's this question of not assigning lordship to anyone but God, and it's problematic if Jews and Christians assign that to their monks or rabbis or to the Messiah. That only Lord should be only applied to God. The fact that in John, begotten seems linked to sonship, and therefore to that element of potential mediation between God and human beings. I think that would be my sense of why the Quran might be disagreeing when it says, "Don't say God begets," or that if that's in connection with this element of sonship or lordship as a mediating figure, it seems that the Gospel of John could be perceived as guilty of that. So I think that would be my concern, not the begotten part on its own. Begotten on its own, you could interpret, I think, in the way you have, but when it's combined with that sonship and lordship, that might be something that the Quran might be more directly disagreeing with. So that would be my, I guess, we could discuss that further, but that would be my pushback on that regard. But I should just also say, but I do think that the part with the logos, there's a lot of assumptions that similarly, some of my current research, people have assumed that the rabbinic text would reject the idea of logos or memra. And part of my research is looking at actually that may be also a wrong assumption. There may not be a direct contradiction. The rabbinic text may not view logos or memra as problematic. So likewise, I think then your analysis that the Quran also may not view notions of logos per se as problematic would fit with that. But it's the other direction of where begotten is connected to sonship or lordship would be a potential sticking point.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Daniel. And I would definitely agree with you. It doesn't necessarily mean, I didn't really necessarily mean that the Quran is using the Gospel of John directly. It could very much be a very indirect way of doing it, and through other mediums, through Christian understandings of the logos, of the Johannine logos. So I would definitely agree with you on that. On the idea of relating the Gospel of John concerning it, of course, the only begotten Son. So thinking of it as sonship, not just, the idea of begetting. Well, in this, what I try to show in my presentation is just the idea of walad. I didn't get into the word ibn or sonship. But if you would like me, I can try to very quickly show you that even from within the Quran, you could still have the idea of sonship. I didn't bring it up here, but I can try to do that. Let me see. I can share my screen very quickly just to show you one little thing, and I hope just to show that perhaps even from within the Quran, a metaphorical concept of sonship is also still possible. Let me bring up my screen here. I hope everybody could see this. And here what I'm doing is I'm trying to compare two different chapters of the Quran. One chapter is Surah Al-Alaq and the other chapter is Surah Al-Rahman. And I'm looking into the beginnings of these two chapters. So in Surah Al-Alaq, it says, "Read in the name of your Lord who created the human out of a clot of congealed blood. Read, and your Lord is the most bountiful, he who taught the use of the pen and taught the human that which he knew not." And Surah Ar-Rahman starts with Ar-Rahman, or the most gracious, who has taught the Quran, who has created the human, and who has taught him al-bayan, or speech or intelligence. When we look into what we may call intra-textualities, now, according to Muslim tradition, Surah Al-Alaq came before Surah Al-Rahman, but regardless of which chapter came before the other, when we look at them, we can see that they are perhaps trying to mirror each other. Both are talking about God teaching. Both are talking about God's creation of human beings. And both are talking about the Quran. Surah Al-Alaq is basically, Iqra, that's where the word Quran really comes from. And so when we read those two together, we see there's lots of, parallelism between those two, the beginning of those two chapters. The question is why? Now, for example, Surah Al-Alaq, proclaim in the name of your Lord. The word or the name Ar-Rahman is one of the names of God anyway. And then both are talking again, as I said, of creation, of khalq, and both are talking about teaching the Quran and teaching that which the human did not know, or teaching al-bayan. So it's very much similar. Now, what's really going on here? Well, if you open pretty much most of the Muslim commentaries on Surah Al-Alaq, what is Al-Alaq? What is this clinging? Because Al-Alaq literally means the clinging. What is this clinging? And most commentaries would tell you, well, it's the clinging of the fetus in the mother's womb. Well, why is it important that Surah Al-Alaq is talking about it? So according to Muslim tradition, it's perhaps even one of the first chapters, if not the first chapter of the Quran. Well, interestingly, if those two are mirroring each other, I would say if we look into the intratextuality and we use polysemy a little bit, and if you would allow me to use polysemy here, polysemy of course means is when a word has multiple meanings, which are related with one another. Well, what is the womb in the Arabic language? It's the same as it is in Hebrew, by the way. It's rahim. And it shares the same root as ar-Rahman. So maybe what's going on here is that the Surah Al-Alaq is not simply talking about the clinging of the fetus in the mother's womb, or in Arabic we would say at-ta'alluq fi rahm al-um, but maybe it's talking about at-ta'alluq bil-Rahman, the clinging onto ar-Rahman, the clinging onto God. And it is using the clinging of the fetus in the mother's womb as a metaphor. So it's more of an analogy, if you like, as someone who clings onto ar-Rahman. But then the one who is born out of the womb is a concept of sonship. Then the one who is born out of the clinging of ar-Rahman, you would still have the concept of sonship, yet again, metaphorically speaking. So, but I'll stop there.
But actually, I probably shouldn't have said. And I think in the metaphorical sense, you can make that argument. I think it's more, but the Quran in multiple places opposing the idea of any specific people claiming or being attributed to being sons of God or son of God. Like especially even like say Jews and Christians claiming we are sons of God. That's opposed. And so I think that my concern not about the notion of son in a general sense, but saying Jesus is the only begotten son, that special sonship is the part that I think where it would become more problematic in relation to that other broader theme in the Quran. But I think you're right, maybe not sonship in the metaphorical sense per se, but special sonship, yeah.
Yes, and that I would definitely agree.
Okay, yeah.
And in the Quran, by the way, Ibn Allah only occurs in only one single verse in the whole Quran. And it's very ambiguous of what it even means. And I know that you're working on the concept of Uzair and who Uzair is and what it is. But that's the only verse where Ibn Allah is there. But as you said, yes, there is another passage which talks about Jews and Christians claiming that they are abna'ullahi wa ahibba'u, the children of God and his beloved. Yes, so there is that other place as well. But again, in that, is it really against the concept of sonship per se, or is it against them thinking that they are beloved of God and things like that? So is it really the word itself that is problematic, or that they are feeling that it's more exclusivist to them?
Yeah.
That's
Okay.
another
Good.
way to think about.
So I want to really thank both Professor Galadari and Professor Weiss, because for me it's been quite a special experience to hear a text which is so much central in Christian tradition treated so carefully in discussion between the sort of its context and reception in Islam and its kind of relationship, as I know some of my colleagues would point out, as a Jewish text to its sort of Jewish context. And it's been really fascinating then hearing the exchange between both of you to remind us how we can make the mistake of finding in a text what we expect to be there. So maybe we've learned and rehearsed controversies, and then we go to arrive at the text expecting to encounter those.
It remains for me to thank profoundly to our presenter, Professor Abdulla Galadari, for his wonderful, illuminating presentation. And thank you very much, Professor Weiss, for your very profound response and for bringing out all those nuances and details that really make this argument more clear. Thank you very much, Dr. Hine, for the contribution and chairing the Q&A. And finally, many, many thanks to all our attendees for your participation, for your time.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Thea, for this wonderful, amazing platform.